By 2310, the situation was looking dire for the railroad. They had lost their major footholds within the urban areas of the Commonwealth. Ammo, weapons, and medical supplies became scarce. Railroad members started to abandon the organization, and the DIA managed to turn some over to the Commonwealth's side. In an attempt to save the organization, they sought to form an unlikely alliance with Hancock and Goodneighbor. Hancock openly voiced his disapproval for the intervention in Far Harbor and the handling of the railroad rebellion. However, Hancock was careful not to associate himself with the railroad. Goodneighbor had a strong anti-synth sentiment, and Hancock was critical of the railroad's refusal to support Ghoul rights. He had no reason to help the railroad, especially since his party, the People's Party, began to gain some traction with the people of the Commonwealth. For the first time in Commonwealth history, it seemed a Ghoul majority party might have a chance to win a seat in the legislature and possibly the executive branch. However, the Commonwealth government held a strong anti-Ghoul sentiment, and they weren't ready to allow Ghouls a stronger say in government. A new law was going through the motions, and eventually it reached the president. This new law was the Mutant Exclusion Act, which sought to systematically exclude Ghouls and other mutants from powerful positions within government and the military. This was justified by pointing to the large number of Ghouls who were supporting the railroad. Hancock was given an ultimatum: step down or we send the army. Hancock had no intention of stepping down from his position as mayor. He reached out to his contacts in the railroad and expressed his interest for an alliance. The terms of the alliance were the following. The railroad would send men to defend Goodneighbor and help Hancock's men in transporting illegal chems throughout the Commonwealth. In return, Hancock would provide the railroad with weapons, supplies, funds, and manpower. The railroad readily agreed, and all remaining agents in downtown Boston made their way to Goodneighbor. They snuck inside using a series of secret underground tunnels. They prepared for the incoming siege by Commonwealth forces. When Hancock refused to abdicate, the army, supported by Brotherhood forces, began to march on Goodneighbor. They were harassed by railroad and Goodneighbor forces, who employed hit-and-run tactics to try and wear down the troops before they arrived at Goodneighbor. Eventually, they would reach Goodneighbor, and the lieutenant in charge of the operation gave Hancock one last chance to end things peacefully. There was no answer from Hancock, so the army began to make their move on the town. But once they reached the gate, they came under heavy fire by a combined force of railroad and Goodneighbor forces. The supporting Brotherhood forces moved in to help breach the gates, but this left the rear undefended. Railroad forces then began to appear all over the rear and completely encircled the Commonwealth forces. The forces requested support from any nearby forces. However, it would be a while until reinforcements arrived. The Commonwealth troops were forced to hold off the enemy forces for 3 hours straight until support arrived. A mechanized platoon arrived to help relieve the army and Brotherhood forces. They attacked the railroad ambushers, but most managed to escape. However, the rear was now safe, and soon the Commonwealth forces would breach the town as well. They flooded Goodneighbor and made their way to Old State House. However, when they entered the building, they found that Hancock had already left. John Hancock was now a fugitive within the Commonwealth, and Goodneighbor was under martial law. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the war raged on. The protocol was making significant progress against the railroad. They didn't do this alone. They were being secretly supplied and trained by the Commonwealth military. Officially, the government did not support the militias as they viewed it as vigilante justice. But behind closed doors, they knew that the militias were a useful tool for combating the railroad without using their own troops, thus allowing them to relocate those soldiers to other regions such as Far Harbor. To aid the militias, the government sent in the Minutemen Special Forces to train them and help them conduct anti-terror operations, all while supplying them with weapons and armor. Together, the Protocol and Minutemen Special Forces conducted multiple raids against railroad bases within the countryside and captured or killed multiple high-value targets. The war on the ground was going well, but the war in the government was a different story. The people were getting tired of the conflict and began to pressure their politicians to push for peace. President Grant was now under pressure to bring the war to an end. Luckily for him, the military was about to make a major breakthrough. Back at Far Harbor, Marines and Brotherhood troops raided Acadia after discovering they were harboring railroad operatives. Without warning, they launched their attack, making quick work of the outside defenses. Once inside, they began to indiscriminately slaughter the inhabitants. Some synths tried to surrender, but they were executed on the spot. By the end of it all, Acadia was nothing but a graveyard. This slaughter was not a good look for the president's administration, so they made sure to keep things secret from the people and the rest of the government. However, this raid provided crucial information that would finally lead to the railroad's defeat. The Marines had discovered multiple documents revealing the locations of all the railroad's remaining hideouts, including Railroad HQ. The HQ was located in the town of Lexington. The military began to plan a raid on the HQ, but they were informed by the DIA that the plan had been compromised and the railroad was fortifying the city. The plan then shifted from a simple raid to a siege. A combined force of Minutemen, Army, and Brotherhood troops would besiege the city and make their way to the railroad HQ. The forces surrounded the settlement. The military requested that the railroad allow civilians to flee. They refused. On the day of August 22, 2312, Minutemen, Special Forces, Army commandos, and DIA agents infiltrated the city in order to get a better idea of the enemy defenses. While some of these troops were captured by railroad agents, the operation was still considered a success, as they were able to reveal some of the enemy's defensive positions and expose their weaknesses. Just a day later, Commonwealth forces began to make their way into the city. The first to enter were Army commandos supported by Brotherhood troops. They were immediately met with gunfire from railroad operatives and Hancock's triggermen. Army and Minutemen troops started to make their way into the city as well, followed by Brotherhood and Army troops in the southeast. The opening days of the battle saw the Commonwealth forces make significant progress. However, the momentum soon shifted as the Commonwealth forces got caught in deadly urban warfare. The Commonwealth forces needed to clear every building to ensure that no enemy fighters could attack the force from the rear. To make matters worse, civilians were scattered all over the city. As troops cleared the building, they would often run into hiding civilians who had no choice but to hunker down and hope for the best. Eventually, the commandos and Brotherhood troops managed to make their way to Railroad HQ. They breached the building's basement and started to clear it in deadly close-quarters combat. Within the building, the troops found the remaining leaders of the railroad and Hancock, the exile himself. The leaders were all executed, but Hancock was taken in alive under direct orders from President Grant. The conflict was then known as the Battle of Lexington. It lasted just over a month and led to much controversy afterwards, especially once it was revealed that Brotherhood troops brutally murdered the synths, some of which were said to have even been children. The president hailed the battle as a major victory and held a rally to celebrate. Thousands attended to celebrate and watch the president give his speech. As the president began to speak, a loud bang was heard from the crowd. The president was shot. He would later die at the local clinic and had his funeral arranged soon after. The shooter was arrested, and it was revealed that he was a railroad sympathizer, though he acted alone. With that, the rebellion was now officially over, and it had gone out with a bang. The post-war situation was tense, especially in regards to the countryside militias. The protocol refused to stand down and surrender their arms to the government. Standoffs ensued, but wanting to avoid yet another rebellion, government forces were often forced to stand down. However, this only led to things getting increasingly worse. At first, it was small things. Farmers would refuse to pay their taxes or ignore draft notices. Warrants would be issued and marshals would be sent in. In response, these farmers often called on the protocol, and together they would force the Federals' retreat. It would finally reach its boiling point when 4 marshals were ambushed on their way to execute a warrant. The 4 men were killed, and the government knew it could no longer ignore this growing threat. The decision was made to send in the army, and they quickly brought an end to the banditry. However, this created resentment amongst the countryside citizens. Many within the protocol continued to operate in secret, often under a different name. However, most of the high-ranking members fled west towards Nuka World. The government knew they would surely pose a threat again in the future, but at the moment they had bigger concerns.